So I think this is a good place to talk about the idea that we victimize ourselves again and again and again through the telling of the story, through the perspective of the story. For most of us, and I don't know if all, but for most of us, our victimization happened sometime in the past. And every time we relive it, we retell it, we move the thoughts in our mind, which we know are neurological loops. The victimization happens again in the body as though it's today. But it's associated with everything that's happening around us today as well. So the true story becomes very, very muddy and very unclear, and also less and less attached to the real situation that happened in the past. So we moved through neutrality, and in willingness and acceptance, without neutrality, there's not even a way to get to willingness and acceptance, because you kind of have to have neutralized that place of, I every day carry my story with me, and I add to it, and I continue it. I keep it alive. I keep the fire burning, like, you're blowing on the embers, maybe at this point. So we're talking about willingness, and the willingness and victimization starts to become the willingness to see all the other perspectives within it. So like Crystal said, I'm starting to see it for the first time. I'm seeing it for what it was or is or isn't. So willingness, we start to be willing to look at all the perspectives. So before this, within victimization, before a lot of this work, we may not have been willing to see any other perspective than the one we're 100% sure happened and they did it, right? Now maybe we see our roles in it. And the roles can be, it's grand scheme. There's a lot of ideas within roles. I mean, if it's a business, what was my part, right? What decisions did I make that were my part that I became involved in, and therefore I have a role. And if I have a role, I have more control over making that happen again or not. If it's something that was completely out of your control, like maybe childhood, we start to look at agreements, our soul family agreements, past life agreements, before life agreements. So some of that may come into play in a way to soften the they did it, that happened to me, directness. So in willingness, we start to open the realm of possibility a little bit more. And it doesn't mean that we change our mind, but we're willing to consider. We consider being more optimist, because in victimizations where we carry a victimization story with us, we're often pessimists. Well, that happened to me, and it happened to me again and again, and I don't have a way out, so it's probably going to happen again in the future. So we start to shift that to like, well, okay, well, I guess that happened, but my future may have nothing to do with that. And it's a considering area. Keeping in mind that we're above 250 in the 310, and there's some energy for that, allowing us to say, well, I don't know, maybe I don't have to carry my story with me. So at this point, the possibilities are, would you be willing, in the realm of all things possible, to be free of a victimization story? So here's where we consider, what would it take, or what would it be like if I never told that story again? Not saying that you don't tell your story again. What I'm saying is, in willingness, we become curious about that. What if we no longer pulled that trailer anymore? What if we unhooked it and our life was free of victimization story? So that curiosity, willingness starts to come in to look at, what might it be like if I no longer packed that bag and took it with me, or pulled the trailer of it, or attached it to myself? So that's willingness. Within acceptance, where it has to do with victimization, becomes tricky without neutrality and without willingness and without all the things below it, because there's forgiveness, and forgiveness can be a big buzzword for a lot of us. Like, If we forgive, does that mean they get off the hook for what they did, and what they did was bad and it hurt me and it hurt a lot of people? And absolutely not, right? So one of the ways that I like to manage forgiveness is taking the words apart. It's for, before, pre, and give. Give it back before it came. So would we be willing to do that? Would we be willing to give back this whole story to wherever it came from and let it live back there, or back in time before the whole thing was ever created? Is one way to manage the idea of forgiveness, of just giving the whole thing back before it ever came. That's one way. Another thing in acceptance is about moving beyond. So Crystal and I were talking about George Norrie and the show, right? Or other spiritual shows or other, self-help shows, where all of a sudden we're like, it just doesn't have any charge. I mean, it doesn't do anything for me. So transcendence is that you kind of move above energetically, above that place where that victimization story still has any desire to live. So in transcendence, it's that moving sort of above it, and another perspective as well. You get to a place where maybe that victimization story and situation doesn't really have anything to do with you now. Lorna said that. I see her nodding. There was a voice that said that doesn't have anything to do with you. In acceptance, we get to experience that place of, I don't think that necessarily has anything to do with me and my future. There's a delineation and no longer pulling the trailer. There's also not a resistance to it within acceptance. Acceptance is a this kind of a movement versus a this kind of a movement. So within acceptance, you don't have a resistance to it anymore. You're like, yeah, okay, so, and I got that to do now, and I got this to do now. My future is over here. It just is a meh. It doesn't, it's that part of neutrality where, yeah, okay, except that happened to me, but it just doesn't have that much to do with me now. Harmonious. It's also a place where things become harmonious. Without the fight of victimization, the constant resistance, the constant put up your dukes, there's harmony in other areas, relationships, nature, our bodies. There is an allowance for harmony in all things to start to flow in, because we're just not in a place of resistance. We're not in fight or flight anymore. And we're not fighting that victimization story in our minds or in our bodies, in our spirits, and actually in our lives. So it could be a really big turning point in victimization.